We're down to our last session. It's the lightning talks. And to present our last session of the day, it's a pleasure to introduce AGS Council Member and Associate Professor of Human Dimensions of Global Environmental Change in the Department of Geographical Science at the University of Maryland at College Park, Dr. Meredith Gohl.
Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, shut your computers, put your phones down, stand up as we welcome our first lightning presenter, Dr. Peter Chen. And while this is happening, we're going to end this. It's going to be great. We're going to spark some heat here because it is freezing up here on the stage. So, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Chen, and I am assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Connecticut. I'm a GIS scientist, and I study food, and also I apply GIS to food access research. And so I will start my presentation with this map, which will be shown momentarily. Okay, so this is the food access or food desert map made by USDA, and this is also known as a food desert map. This map shows regions in the US where the healthy food or supermarkets are relatively limited. Like food desert, GIS-based food access modeling has been used to correlate with socio-economic status, which can be also used for studying health disparity and food equity. Eventually, they help us to support health policy making and decisions. One overlooked aspect in these GIS models is the nutrition component, such as if a restaurant is serving healthy food. And as many of our today's speakers mentioned, the future of our food rests on this nutrition component. And in the past, this evaluation is based on individual store survey. However, because the labor and intensive nature, this survey cannot be applied to a big scale. And recently, AI-based image recognition model could help us to perform nutrition assessment. This model, called Calorie Mama, is also what we use for this study. It can help us to identify the food label and nutrition information from a food image. And this slide shows the example of this model. By inputting a food image into the model's API, we can derive the food label, which is a euro, and its associated nutrition information. We have implemented this model to all restaurants in Hartford, Connecticut. Specifically, we connected restaurants' food images from food review websites, including TripAdvisor and Google Places. In total, we collected over 15,000 food images from 470 restaurants in the study area. Of course, we excluded non-food items. And these food images were further tailored, filtered, and cropped as input into this model. And then we derived the nutrition information on two different levels. One is on restaurant level, another is on sensor tract level. And the results will come up very soon. Okay, so here you can see our results. On the left side is a restaurant level. We can derive the nutrition level of each restaurant and also aggregated those nutrition information on the sensor tract level on the right side. Okay, and we also validated the model using trained raters. And our validation shows the accuracy level of the two is over 75% off. It is really satisfactory. Lastly, we developed an interactive WebGIS platform to showcase our model. You may check out our results on harvardrestaurant.org using your computer or cell phone. So, as one of the first studies using deep learning models for food access research, we feel this method has big potential. By leveraging the big data and deep learning models, we are able to make a geographic transition in the study of community food environment. These are my team members, and we also have 2 publications in the Journal of Nutrients and also Applied Geography. And feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Our second lightning talk is by Mr. Brian Cateman. Brian?
All right, everyone, buckle up for a quick story here. I grew up in Staten Island, New York, which is not known to be the most, amazing, not known to be the most progressive of places in terms of New York City, in terms of plant-based food. But one of the reasons I liked growing up there was that there was a lot of nature and green trails. And so as a young kid, I kind of fell in love with the natural world, not only those green environments, but also the animals that were living in those spaces. By the time I got to college, I was your typical environmentalist. I would tell people that they should recycle, that they should compost, that they should walk instead of drive. But it wasn't until later in college that I made the connection to food. I was on my way to present some undergraduate climate research with some classmates, and I was actually eating a hamburger on the plane. And a friend of mine who knew I was interested in sort of moral philosophy and other issues handed me this book that was called The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And that was really a transformative moment for me because as much as I cared about the environment, I'd never really made the connection to food, specifically the way that we raise animals for food. 99% of animals raised in the United States and raised are factory farms. And as many of you know, these are places where these animals are crammed in very cruel conditions. Massive land use is driving biodiversity loss. Lots of water is used. 14.5% of greenhouse gases globally come from industrial animal agriculture. And so, for all these reasons, I decided that I wanted to do the sensible thing. I wanted to essentially try to become vegetarian on my way to being fully vegan. Just making sure the slides are, they're automatic. Okay, great. And so, for the most part, that worked out. There were some surprising benefits of essentially being vegan. My acne cleared up. I had more energy than I was used to. But, there was also some moments where I fell off the plant-based bandwagon, as they say. I remember one particular moment where I was at a Thanksgiving dinner, which is coming up with my family in New Jersey, and I had put every possible vegetable that I could on my plate. And the turkey is going around and around the table. And my dad, he says to me, "Come on, Brian, it's Thanksgiving. Have a little piece of turkey." And I remember popping this piece of turkey in my mouth. And for those of you who have siblings might relate to this if you have a rivalry. But remember my sister, she said, "Oh, I thought you were a vegetarian, Brian." And I remember not having the words to describe how I felt, but I felt irked. I was kind of pissed. I was one of the people at the table who had made a commitment to try to cut back on the amount of animal products that I was consuming. And I wasn't like the typical American. I wasn't like my family members who were eating well over 200 pounds of meat a year. In 2021, it was the highest in recorded history. 225 pounds of meat were consumed. And so I had another experience where I was at an IHOP on Staten Island, International House of Pancakes. There was a waiter who had taken away a plate from one of my friends, and there was a piece of bacon on it. And I had reasoned that, if this bacon is going to go to waste anyway, I might as well eat the piece of bacon. So I took this piece of bacon and I popped it in my mouth. And perhaps as a self-identifying Jewish vegetarian adds another layer of complexity to this story. As you may know, Jews are not supposed to eat bacon. So, I was tired of getting flack from omnivores for not being perfect. They felt as though I was sort of taking credit. "Oh, I thought the slides were moving automatically. It says 1 minute left." That's confusing. Okay. Oh, now they're moving really fast. Look at this. All right, I came up with this concept called reducitarian to describe people who are committed to cutting back on animal products. It's not an all or nothing premise. We have this idea that you're either a vegan or you're not, but this is counterproductive. We should be trying to encourage people to eat more plant-based foods rather than trying to encourage them to be perfect. This can be on a personal dietary level. This can be on an institutional level. If we can get a large number of people to make a small change, that's going to make a much greater difference than getting a small number of highly committed people to go vegan or vegetarian. This does not have to be overnight. You don't necessarily have to go cold turkey. All motivations matter. Whether you care about this issue or food because of environment or health or food justice or animal issues or whatever it is, it puts us all on the same team. And what we must resist is infighting. We as a movement cannot engage in what's called horizontal hostility, where we're competing with one another. No matter why you're here, ending factory farming is essential for all of the issues that we care about. Not too bad. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much for the quote, Dr. Schwartz. Our next presenter is Mr. Andrew Krechowitz. Take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So yesterday I was walking down Broadway, and I guess it was I got here a little early, and I'm trying to find the doors over there. And Columbia worker sees me trying to get in the doors. And they're like, oh, you're trying to get in, you're early. So I start talking, and they were like, oh yeah, this conference looks really interesting. They saw the sign. Like, what's going on with the conference? Like, tell me about it. Are you in the conference? And I'm like, well, it's a conference on geography, or a meeting on geography, but I'm a meteorologist. And they were like, oh, a meteorologist. I always wanted to meet a meteorologist. And I said, oh, really? Okay, that's nice. And they're like, let me ask you a question. I said, sure. They said, I got 5 weather apps on my phone. Which one do I trust? And I said, well, it depends. But I was trying to explain, that's exactly the type of work that I do, is to try to figure out that question. Which map do you trust? What does it mean to trust data? What does it mean to trust a map? What does it mean to trust science? And in the context of food security, what does it mean to understand incomplete assumptions, where we're trying to understand the climatic and meteorological impacts on food security and food systems? So here we see a Google search output of, I forget what I put, crop failure. And yeah, we see a lot of drought. We see a lot of dry conditions. We see a lot of brown. We don't see much on heavy rainfall or flooding. And myself and research team, this is something that we're testing. We're trying to understand the importance, the degree to which we need to better understand the complexities of the influence of climate and weather on food security. This map right here shows a seasonal climate forecast. We actually produce these here at Columbia University. Anywhere in the blue, greens, and blues, it indicates areas where over the next 3 months we're likely to see above average rainfall. Yellows and browns, where we're likely to see below average rainfall. If I point you in the direction of Africa, you could see that in the greater Horn of Africa, East Africa there, we are seeing browns and yellows. This is indicative of below average rainfall, and many of you are probably aware, this is, I think, the 4th consecutive season where we're seeing below average rainfall. However, there's other colors on that map. There's greens and blues in parts of Central Africa and Western Africa. But if we're asking questions about food security, risk of food system failures based on climatic extreme weather events in Africa, it's totally fair to focus on those yellows and browns. But what our argument is that that is an incomplete way to assess the impacts of climate and weather on food systems in particular. So there we go. And this year, we're seeing that. We're seeing exactly that. We're seeing stories coming out of West Africa and Nigeria about how the rains and the floods are impacting food systems. This quote by Adaku Jane Ichendu, I think, sums it up very well. As evidenced by the National Agricultural Plans, which don't even acknowledge the role of disasters on food security, and by extension, specifically flooding, is something that is lacking more than other disasters. I know there was some talk, I really appreciated the discussion about the importance of looking at disasters, especially complex and cascading disasters on food systems. So we focused on floods. We looked at historical food security data over the past years, and essentially we have a paper which is the paper that I'm talking about today. If you're interested, it's out in PNAS, and it's called The Impact of Flooding on Food Security Across Africa. Without getting into the specifics of the details, I'll just go over some of the high-level takeaways. So basically, floods do matter in terms of food security is what we found. The signal is not simple. In some places, we see kind of mixed signals of initial negative impacts and then longer-term positive impacts or vice versa. In some places, we see flooding positively impacting food systems no matter what time scale we look at. In other areas, we see mostly negative impacts. We also are seeing the importance of disaggregation of flood type when looking at the impacts of flooding on food systems. So here on a map, this is an output of a Granger causality map, is what we call it, which is a type of statistical hypothesis test. And in the sub-national areas that have the different colors, this shows where we see this relationship between flooding and the influence, or an influence on food security. It doesn't really tell us the positive or negative influence. For that, we have to zoom in and look at the local narrative and talk to the local stakeholders to see what type of impact it was. But the main takeaways are, floods do matter when we're thinking about food systems and food security. We need to look at that more. We need to look at floods in relation with drought, or when they happen as a cascading feature, and we need more specified data, specifically impact data, to do so. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Our next lightning talk is Mr. Cameron Kruse from the Earth Genome.
Hey there, Cameron from the Earth Genome. Today I'm here to introduce a project we started working on, and it's also an invitation to get involved. So hopefully my slides progress forward, and thanks for sticking around through this Arctic survival study we've all ended up in. Okay, so this is no news to anyone after this conference. The food system is impacting our climate. 50%, or the emissions from the food system, if we don't change anything, are projected to increase by at least 50% in the next 30 years. But climate change is also disrupting the global food system. You know, as we've learned today in many different talks, there are so many impacts to both food security and just livelihood across the world. This project is meant to connect these two trends. And our key stakeholders, we're working with the State Department now on food security. We're trying to design a system and a tool where we can tell stories and connect data related to food systems, food security, agriculture, and climate. So we're here today, I'm with Earth Genome. Earth Genome, we're a digital product agency for the environment. We tell stories in ways that we can connect people with the data and the world around them. And we tell stories about places where things are colliding, intersections of places, intersections of things. Here are two different tools our nonprofit arm recently launched. Climate Trace, launched at COP27 this year, allows you to track emissions down to the emitter level. So it's an interactive map you can go through after the conference. But about this project, we envision a sustainable, equitable food system, and we want to explore how the food system affects our climate, how the climate affects our food, and exactly how this works. Connect these two narratives, not just one, it's a cycle, they're connected. We've talked about Pakistan, it was said earlier in the conference, as ground zero for how climate change is influencing food. So I'm gonna do a quick spotlight of an example exploration of what we are doing on this project. Okay, so a few maps, hopefully they work and show up. Here's work from FuseNet and IPC. We aggregated this all onto a map where you can interact with historical food security data over time. You can see that it has various food security states. It doesn't have a perfect track record, right? Sometimes there's famines due to weather events, natural disasters, other factors. This year, as we know, there's been historical flooding. Here's data we extracted from satellite imagery. We found where the more flooded regions were, and we're able to show these on a map and allow users to interact with it. So now we know that Pakistan doesn't have a great track record with food security. There's flooding, and they get their wheat imports and grain imports from Ukraine and Russia, 75%. And this just doesn't bode well for Pakistan's food security. We heard today that there's going to be more exports coming out of Ukraine, so that's a good sign. But it does lead to the question, what's happening now? And that's what this project is designed to answer. The data is out there, right? We should be able to predict what is going to happen in Pakistan related to their food security, what is happening there related to these climate events, but that story needs to be unified, and that's what this project's all about, and that's what we've started trying to do. So here are 3 questions that we're trying to learn and explore, and then if you want to get out your phones, there's like an invitation to participate. So I'll go through these 3 questions, and then we'll get into that. So as we've gotten into this field, we've realized that there are tons of smart people, many of them in this room, that are already exploring these questions. So here are some of the things we've distilled down. Are there tipping points and intensities in the intensity of extreme events that will cause global food shortages? If there are, we want to find those and expose those and make sure that those rise to the top for decision makers that are presented with this complex data. This has been talked about several times during this conference already, so I don't need to go too into depth, but what are feasible top-down and bottom-up pathways to enhance food security? That's a really interesting question. It can be approached from so many angles. We want to surface that question in an intelligent way. Lastly, this is probably what I'm most interested in, is how might AI and machine learning be used to help improve early warning systems? There's so much data out there right now. It can really help answer some hard questions. Okay, quick, this is where we want to pull out your cameras if you want to get involved. How we work, we like to build in the open. We have all the code, all the maps I've showed today, all that's available for you if you want to get involved. If you have trouble sleeping, we actually live stream some of our coding sessions, so if you're interested in that, feel free to join. All the data that I use today is on our GitHub repo here if you want to access. Again, we're very passionate about bringing people together here. We're really trying to break down silos by telling stories. Here are some examples of things we've built. You can find these in the links I shared before. Again, this is great data. I think it's actually made by a lot of people in this room. We're just trying to use it to tell stories and display it in a way where a storyline comes through to answer questions. Reach out, get involved. We are looking for people with data, people that make data look good, and people that are just interested in this field and we can learn from. So thanks for having me here today.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ms. Weijun Liu.
Hi, I'm Weishun. I'm going to talk about how we measure perceived food space and how it is changing our food activities. Just imagine that you are going to do grocery shopping and you randomly walk into a store. What if the store looks like the picture on the right? Will you go there next time? And how about the store like the first picture? You might be willing to patronize this store again and again. So this is an example of how perceptions shape our food behaviors. For the structure of my presentation, I will first cover the project background and the new concept we proposed, and I will also introduce the approaches we employed, the findings, and our next steps. There is a consensus that the food environments could influence food behaviors and thus induce the dietary health comorbidities. An overlooked facet here is a lack of discussion on individual perceptions of their community food environments. We believe that the food behaviors are also influenced by the perceived food environments. Therefore, we propose a research question. How people perceive their community food environments. So by answering this question, we would like to understand how to use geospatial technologies to measure people's perceptions of their embodied food opportunities and visualize it. So the first step, we propose a new concept. It's called perceived food activity space. We define the perceived food space as a spatial distribution of food sources perceived by residents. So this new concept was substantiated by us in a case study. We conducted this case study in the Greater Hartford region, Connecticut. And here is a map showing our study area. It is including Hartford and its surrounding towns. In the case study, we employ a candle mixed method approach, and it is combines a structured survey and GIS modeling techniques. So in doing so, we draw on the strengths of both approaches, and it also helps to incorporate the expertise and the experience of those who outside the academia into our food research. So here is the outline of our survey. It involves surveying the people's home locations, food activity locations, and their perceived food locations. And we also measure their food security status and collect their social demographics. So to distribute the survey, our team posted the flyers to the on-site locations in the greater Hartford region and make sure there is equal coverage. And we also facilitate the distribution to the entire Hartford communities on Facebook. So we measured and visualized the perceived food space in the context of the GIS. Here is a map. The green area shows the perceived food space of a single respondent, and the red dashed line is her food activity space. So we have found that the perceived food space could shape individuals' food activity space. And after this, we would like to examine if the perceived food space is moderated by the food security status or some other individual variables. So what we have found here is that there are two individual variables associated with the difference between perceived food space and the food activity space. The first one is access to car. So this might due to the travel resistance could be perceived and evaluated very differently by the people who have access to car and who do not have a car. And we also found that the marital status was also associated with the difference between perceived food space and food activity space. So this accounts for the personal attitudes towards which kind of activities are perceived feasible, will be shaped by the social context and one's position within the context. So to sum it up, our findings share new insights into understanding food behaviors in a new perceptual dimension. And in the future, we would like to understand how the perceived food space influence.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Our next presenter is Miss Katie Magaki.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Magaki, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service. And today I'm going to be very briefly talking about what we've done in Ukraine over the last year with the ongoing conflict that Ukraine is having with Russia. So, in a normal year, we typically use many different data sources to quantify agricultural production in Ukraine. And I'm hoping my slide will show that. Here it is. Okay, so we already heard from Laura Geller earlier today. She's our attaché based in Ukraine. So we do have people in Kyiv. We use satellite imagery. We do statistical crop yield modeling. We crop travel. So I was in Ukraine in 2019 ground truthing to see what agriculture actually looks like on the ground. We use government data, so planting progress, harvest progress, and then weather data. So we typically use the World Meteorological Organization's weather stations. But this is not a normal year, so many of our data streams have gone offline. Obviously, the US government's not going to send me to Ukraine right now, so that's a non-starter. The Ukrainian government's no longer publishing on any of the oblasts under conflict. And then, as of a few days ago, all of the WMO stations have gone offline. So we still have our staff in Kyiv, we still have local staff there, and then we've been relying on high-res imagery and still some of the statistical yield modeling to kind of make up the difference in these data gaps. So one of the first questions that we got asked, like early in the conflict, winter wheat was planted when the conflict had begun. And so we wanted to visualize where wheat was planted by oblast, so by the subnational region in Ukraine. And we were trying to divide the country into what we consider to be free Ukraine versus conflict Ukraine. So all of conflict Ukraine is in the hash marks. And the best way to do this was to visualize it in a map. It was easy for the Secretary of Agriculture to see and understand what exactly we were talking about. One of the other things that we did early in the conflict, so this image is about a month after the conflict began. We wanted to see if farmers were going to do any fieldwork preparations for their summer crops. So one of the things that farmers typically do is they burn their fields prior to planting the next season's crop. Kind of proof of this from my crop travel in 2019. Basically, they're trying to rid the field of any harvest stubble so they can plant the next season's crop. And we did see this. So they were doing fieldwork preparation even after the conflict began. So they were going to have a crop season. Another data source that we've been using for the last 20 years or so is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. This is a measure to monitor crop health. And even in times of conflict, like we've been having over the last year, it's still really useful to use as an indicator, because if farmers aren't using as much fertilizers as they usually do, or if they're not using hybrid seeds, this is going to be reflected in some of these derived satellite products. So it's still very useful for quantifying yields. And then for the first time this year, thanks to our NGA partners, we have gotten access to high-res satellite imagery. So we've started to use this in part of our operational workflow. And so for USDA, we're interested not in just what farmers are planting, what they're actually going to be harvesting, because that's the stuff that gets into the domestic and local markets. And so in this case, this is a farm in Mykolaiv, and so 3 tractors are going across the field at once, which means they're putting manpower, resources, fuel into getting these crops out. And unfortunately, I'm going to end my slide on sort of a negative note, but I don't want you to take the don't take my presentation as negative, but basically there's a bunch of fields, way too many examples of burn scars across the landscape. So this is conflict-related burning. You can see the bomb craters over there towards the left. And I'm not a military expert, I will be the first to say that, but from my perspective, these are fields that farmers are not going to be able to harvest, so this is grain that's not going to be getting into the local and domestic markets. So, thank you very much. Basically, I want you to take 2 things away from this presentation. One is that nothing happens in a vacuum, so what's happening in Ukraine is impacting what's happening in your local grocery stores. And 2 is that USDA is increasingly reliant on high-res imagery and other geospatial tools to do our analysis. So, thank you very much, and come find me at the social.
Thank you so much. Our next lightning talk is Dr. Kanwar Singh.
Good evening, everyone. After all wonderful talks and panels, one thing comes to mind, and that is agricultural impact evaluation and the quest to make impact evaluation cost-effective and powerful. My name is Dr. Kanwar Singh, and I'm geospatial scientist and affiliate faculty at the College of William and Mary. I want to introduce a project that we just began. We call it GeoField. It aims to strengthen impact evaluation by incorporating Earth observation data as an element of evaluation. It is funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it was launched this year, September 1st. So it's a brand new project. To elaborate it further, environmental scientists have long history of using Earth observation to measure biophysical conditions of resources essential for climate-sensitive agriculture. Likewise, social scientists in estimating counterfactual comparisons. However, now climate change presents an urgent call and somewhere opportunity to scientists to these fields to work together with innovators, data, and technology providers to integrate Earth observations with impact evaluations. Integrating Earth observation data into impact evaluations offers a strong return on project compared to ground-based observations. GeoField project aims to show how Earth observation can dramatically enlarge sample size, expand the geographic scope, and in time coverage of evaluations, permitting researchers to study climate-sensitive agriculture across developing countries. GeoField also aims to develop resources for implementing organizations and walk them through the process of designing and managing an Earth observation-based impact evaluation project. Resources will include scientific papers, tools, data, tutorials, methods, and policy briefs. Through this geospatial GeoField project, we plan to have an expanded range of outcomes, studies on impacts under changing climate conditions, and more periodic and historical reassessment. Since Earth observation offers cost-effective options to create time series data for tracking the longer trails of impacts. Within this project, we will make efforts so that organizations adopt our methods for similar use cases. And the same way, we expect more evaluation will become possible even in difficult to survey contexts, for example, Ukraine. and reflect gendered barriers to equity and transformation that will also change the pace of innovation in impact evaluations. We plan to accomplish these through identifying and prioritizing use cases. We will pursue a few rapid impact use cases which will rely on existing evaluations and open access Earth observation data so that they can be completed within a shorter time span. This project will also conduct longer impact use cases, which involves either custom measurements or prospective impact evaluation designed ahead of actual interventions. Our plan is to develop an evaluation process and decision-making framework based on a variety of factors. For example, broader use of impact Earth observation in climate-sensitive agriculture impact evaluation, access to existing and planned impact evaluations, meeting the objectives of global climate and agricultural development goals, diversity of scale, and in the use cases. In the next 4 years, this project will utilize a community of practices approach to build a community of communities of experts, advisors, and leaders in their field. Focus activities will include scoping research projects, finding other local experts, collecting validation data, acting as a local ambassador, and sharing best practices across their network. Therefore, community of practices will be an integral part in the pursuit of sustainability and scalability of appropriate Earth observation within impact evaluation beyond the life of this project. Finally, by laying out the value proposition of incorporating Earth observation into agricultural impact evaluation and supporting its take-up among the community of practices, the GeoField will allow powerful evaluation and learning about what works in climate-sensitive global agricultural development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have Miss Janine Jung.
Hello, who likes lychees? Okay. So if you like these, your best bet to get them today is to go to Chinatown, but in the off chance that you find them in Whole Foods or Seatown or something, they're probably going to be about twice the price. Now, how do Chinatown grocers get their hands on hard-to-get produce and at such low prices? The answer is a century-old produce supply chain based on long-standing relationships. So let's go to the source. Less than 1% of farms in America are owned by Asians, and those that are significantly smaller, and over half of them specialize in producing specialty crops. I'm going to pause here for a second to call out Valerie and Bruce. She's an economic botanist over at SUNY Binghamton, and all my digging led to her research in which she visited over 70 farms in Honduras and Florida and followed the hidden distribution network all the way to produce markets in Chinatown. We're going to look at that in a bit, but first, let's take a look at the mainstream distribution channel. Most of the produce that makes its way to New York City gets to a massive distribution center in Hunts Point in the Bronx. These are carried by integrated trucking companies, and these small farms with relationships with major distributors basically piggyback on these trucks to get themselves to New York. But here's where it looks different. Instead of Hunts Point, they get to clusters of highly competitive wholesalers, individually owned and operated, fewer than 5 employees, and they're all in Chinatown, in and around like the clusters. And this one is near Grand Street subway station. It's about a 2-minute walk from a retail market where I like to shop. There are about 12 of them in a 5-block radius, and even more that you can't see on the map because they are push carts. Because of this proximity, we have dynamic restocking, meaning frequent deliveries throughout the day, which keeps the produce fresh. So you can see this is why the costs are low and why they were so hard hit by COVID. So Chinatown lost more than average food service jobs over the pandemic, but received half the average PPP loans. Why? Language barriers, cash-only operations, and low digital literacy. And this really interesting tidbit. So loans in the city were provisioned by the zip codes. So if you were a merchant in Chinatown that spilled just into some of the more affluent neighborhoods, you were not eligible for loans. So this is actually related to a problem that predated the pandemic, which is gentrification creep in this part of town. So residential real estate prices are really making it hard for warehouses to operate in this space. This is a snapshot of luxury condos in Chinatown. And just 1 block north of this boundary, you're going to see what the trade-off is for a vibrant supply chain at your doorstep. So it's a lot of back and forth of minivans and forklifts and crates. And so when affluent neighbors really want to get rid of these eyesores, how do we protect this very vibrant produce supply chain? So city rezoning plans that have been approved are always coming up against heavy opposition from local community organizations that are trying to protect their backyard. So these battles are never ending. But the most visible upcoming change to Chinatown's last mile is the world's tallest jail that's going to be in Chinatown, replacing Rikers. Scheduled for completion in 2027, that's what it's going to look like, and it's going to really eat into some really densely populated small business areas in Chinatown. This is really going to be devastating for the Chinatown supply chain. So, what do we as geospatial technologists do here? Well, we can help put some of these small businesses on our map. So, and by doing this, when people are designing loan programs or rezoning plans, we can then think about who's on the ground and what's at stake. This is Send Chinatown Love, an NGO that supports small businesses by putting them on the map. Here's an example of a Chinatown's oldest meat butcher that was scheduled, actually facing eviction earlier this year. And because of Send Chinatown's help in pushing location-based social media, they were able to raise lots of funding to live to see another day. Next, with more access to GIS data, we've talked a lot about Chinatown, Manhattan today, but how do we grow more Chinatowns? There are lots of upcoming enclaves of Asian American populations in New York City. Right across the East River over there is Long Island City, a neighborhood with 34% Asian population, which is about 5x increase since 2010. And that is one of the many new Asian groceries that have popped up there in the past year. And what this means is new entrepreneurs are able to use GIS data to map new last miles across New York City based on demographic trends. Finally, can we bring Chinatown to your doorstep? So delivery services really blossomed during the pandemic and the lockdown, but post-COVID, some of them are here to stay. This is AsianVeggies.com. The son of a wholesaler started this website after his father's business, a wholesaler, dried up during the pandemic. And what he did was he threw all this inventory online on an e-commerce website. And now this delivery zone map today is their new last mile. So very much like how you use FreshDirect today, except you have access to a much wider array of Asian produce. What you can do now is just press a button, and then you can track your vegetables all the way to your doorstep. So
thank you so much.
I like Chinatown, and I would love for you to support them now that you have a better understanding of where your vegetables come from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our Lightning Talk presenters and for keeping time. As we mentioned yesterday, there were a number of people who proposed Lightning Talks, but they weren't able to join us. And so all of that content is on Geography 2050's website. Well, the program committee evaluated some of those presentations and put some of them online. So without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Marie and Chris.
All right. Hey, give yourselves a round of applause for actually staying this long through the day. Really appreciate everybody being here. I'm the guy who really wants to thank our partners and our sponsors. Columbia Climate School has just been a fantastic partner, getting us back on the bicycle this year after 2 years down from COVID. So thanks so much. Our long-term special supporters, Fund for the City of New York, Open Geospatial Consortium, and the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. Thank you for your stalwart support of the society. The Zucker Family Foundation, Esri, Nat Geo, Black Cape, AAG, Crunchy Data, the GEF, Rutledge, thank you so much for making this possible. Without your support, your financial support, we wouldn't be able to make this happen.
The vision at the American Geographical Society is to be the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society. And one of the ways we do that is through radical collaboration. And I think this event today is a really powerful example of radical collaboration. Really different people from different perspectives and dealing with such an important topic. So thank you all for being here. Just as a reminder, teachers, thank you for being here, and you have more tomorrow. And I promise you it will be warmer in the building where we sit tomorrow. And also we want to thank our corporate angels. They are fantastic. Stay with us. More hopefully will join us. And with that, Chris, final word?
Yeah, so we'll be announcing.
Oh, I forgot one thing, sorry. Antoinette Winkler-Prenz and Moses Kinsanga, both who presented here, are going to be the guest editors of the Geographical Review special issue on the future geography of food. The call for papers goes out December 1. Be on the lookout. We'll send it to all the participants. Submit your ideas and be in the journal. Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. So we will be announcing our theme for next year in the coming weeks, but I want you to do 3 favors for me right now. Open your phone, just like this, open your calendar, and put in a save the date for November 16th and 17th of 2023, because we would like to have you back right here next year. The second favor that I would really like of you is, if you're on social media at all, go to @AmericanGeo and @Geography2050. Review the highlights of all the things got tweeted out and retweet it to all your friends, including the save the date tweet that will be going out soon. And then the third favor I'd really like for you to do for me, for the society, is go through those doors and join us for a reception right now. Thank you very much.